The sea had always been a mirror of contradictions along the Alaskan coast. It could cradle fishermen in days of calm where the horizon stretched like a quiet promise, or it could rise in sudden tempests that swallowed boats and men without a trace. In the winter of 1984, the waters near Kodiak carried that edge of unpredictability, a subtle vibration in the air that seasoned fishermen learned to respect. The fishing boat in question, a modest vessel weathered by years of use, left harbor one morning under skies that were heavy but not yet threatening. Its wooden hull bore scars from countless journeys, and its nets, coiled neatly along the deck, carried the smell of salt and work. The men aboard moved with practiced rhythm, each gesture part of a choreography learned through repetition and necessity. The harbor that morning was a place of small rituals. Families waved from the docks, bundled in thick coats, their breath rising like pale smoke against the chill. The captain gave a final glance toward the shoreline, his eyes narrowing as though memorizing a detail he might need to recall later. The boat slipped out to sea, its engine steady, its wake folding back into the grey water almost as quickly as it was made. For those watching from land, the vessel shrank to a dot against the horizon and then became part of the undifferentiated expanse of ocean. Nothing in its departure suggested it would not return. As hours turned to days, the weather worsened. Reports spoke of swells that towered high and winds that stripped the sea into streaks of foam. Other boats returned to harbor battered but intact, their crews worn down by the fight, but relieved to see land again. This boat did not return. Its absence stretched from worry into dread, and from dread into an unspoken certainty that it was lost. The Coast Guard deployed search missions, combing the waters with aircraft and patrol vessels, scanning the shifting waves for wreckage, life rafts, or any signal that the crew had survived. What they found was emptiness. The ocean gave back nothing. Back in town, the loss etched itself into the lives of those waiting. The wives of the crew gathered in kitchens where the radio stayed on, listening for updates that never came. Children asked questions that could not be answered. The men who had known the crew best, fellow fishermen who understood the sea's capacity for cruelty, spoke less and worked more, their silence heavy with knowledge. The town itself seemed altered, as if one of its supports had been removed and the entire structure leaned imperceptibly under the weight of grief. Weeks passed before the official search was abandoned. The announcement carried no ceremony, just a thin statement that the boat and its men were presumed lost. But the absence lingered. At the docks, the slip where the vessel once tied remained empty, a gap that seemed to stare back at anyone who passed. On stormy nights, some claimed they could hear echoes of engines far offshore, as though the boat still labored against the waves. But such claims dissolved with the morning light. The story of the disappearance joined the larger folklore of the Alaskan coast, where tales of vanished ships and unanswered questions were as common as the smell of fish and diesel fuel. Yet this one carried a sharper edge, perhaps because it was recent, perhaps because those who vanished had been so present in the lives of those left behind. There was no wreck to bury, no bodies to mourn, only an endless expanse of water that seemed to resist closure. The last recorded note of the boat came from a log kept by the Coast Guard. The date of departure, the estimated coordinates, the acknowledgement of radio contact in the first hours of its journey. Then silence. Radios that once crackled with chatter became void. The frequency that carried its call sign was quiet, as if swallowed by the ocean itself. For decades afterward, that silence would endure, a reminder both of the fragility of life at sea and of mysteries that the water was unwilling to surrender. But in the moment of 1984, it was still fresh. Families drifted into a new rhythm shaped by absence. Some kept the men alive in memory, holding on to photographs that yellowed slowly on mantelpieces. Others tried to push forward, marrying again, building new lives, though the shadow of loss lingered even there. The boat had vanished, but its imprint did not. In quiet corners, in the spaces left open at tables, in the way children grew up with stories instead of fathers, the absence took root. Years would pass before anyone spoke of the vessel again with urgency. Time dulled but did not erase, and the sea remained unchanged, vast and indifferent. The fishing boat's name faded from official records, but not from memory. It became one of those unfinished sentences the ocean so often wrote. No one could know that decades later, In a world of satellites and digital signals, that unfinished sentence would suddenly find its echo across the airwaves, carrying a plea for help that should have been impossible. In the wake of the disappearance, the town settled into an unsteady silence, a kind of collective hush that spread through homes, streets, and gathering places. Fishing towns along the Alaskan coast were no strangers to loss, yet each tragedy carved its own shape into the community. This one seemed sharper, more jagged because the boat had gone with no trace, no wreckage, no sign to soften the finality. It was as if the sea had not only taken the men, but had erased their existence altogether, leaving those left behind to wrestle with absence that offered no answers. In kitchens where the smell of fish once mingled with bread and coffee, tables now felt emptier, conversations shorter. The wives of the crew bore their grief in different ways. Some continued to wear their rings, keeping the space beside them at night as though still occupied, sheets cold but carefully untouched. Others removed the symbols of marriage, folding them into drawers, closing them away like chapters they could no longer keep open. The rhythms of their days shifted, not with choice but with necessity. Bills had to be paid, children clothed, homes kept. Work was found where it could be, often in canneries or temporary positions. The town's economy itself reshaped by the missing income once brought in by the vanished boat. Children carried the loss in subtler, stranger ways. Some grew quiet, watching the horizon with a seriousness far beyond their years, as if waiting for a shape to return. Others spoke of their fathers in the present tense, unwilling to accept that absence could equal finality. In classrooms, drawings of boats appeared again and again, crude sketches with lines for waves, sails filled with wind, and suns always drawn above as though insisting on a brighter ending. Teachers learned to let the drawings be, folding them into folders that filled with silent testimony to grief too young to articulate. The men who had known the lost crew most intimately, fellow fishermen, bore their mourning differently. They returned to sea, because to stop would mean surrendering not only to grief but to poverty. Yet each departure carried a sharper edge of risk, the memory of how quickly a vessel could vanish, shadowing every task. They spoke less than before, their eyes more often on the horizon, their trust in the sea thinner. At bars and harborside sheds, the missing boat became a subject approached cautiously, as though to name it too directly might invite more loss. The town itself, physically, bore marks of the tragedy. The dock where the boat had once moored remained open, its cleats unused, a gap that locals avoided filling as if leaving the space was its own form of respect. Shops that once extended credit to the families grew cautious, some closing altogether, victims not only of economic strain but of the pall that seemed to hang over the community. Yet life pressed forward as it always did. New boats came, crews formed, children grew taller. The wound remained, but it became part of the landscape, stitched into the fabric of the town's identity. Every year on the anniversary of the disappearance, candles appeared on windowsills, some openly, some quietly, lit not so much in hope but in remembrance. For a time, those nights bound the community together. Neighbors who rarely spoke might share a nod, acknowledging their shared grief. But as the years moved on, the tradition thinned. New families arrived who did not remember, who did not know the names of the lost crew. The memory, though still alive, became less communal, more private, held tightly only by those whose bloodlines were tied to the sea that had swallowed the men. By the late 1990s, much of the world beyond Alaska had forgotten. The incident was reduced to a line in maritime records, a missing vessel among many. Yet in the town, it endured like a scar. The widows aged, their children became adults, and the story shifted from lived grief into inherited memory. Photographs remained on mantels, faces frozen in the early 1980s, never allowed to grow older. A sweater folded neatly in a trunk, a watch left on a dresser, a knife with a worn handle. All these small artifacts carried weight far beyond their material worth. They were anchors in a life that had been cut loose too suddenly. Some who stayed in town began to believe that the sea kept what it took because it had to, because balance demanded it. The loss became less about why and more about how to continue living around it. Others left, unable to bear the constant reminder. They moved inland, seeking distance from water that had betrayed them, yet the memories followed, surfacing in dreams and in the faint smell of salt carried by wind on days when the air felt wrong. In time, the community was reshaped not only by grief, but by resilience. The town of widows, as some quietly called it, learned to survive in the shadow of absence. The story of the lost boat became a cautionary tale for younger fishermen, a reminder of the sea's indifference, a narrative parents used when teaching their sons about respect for waters that could not be controlled. Yet beneath the caution lay something softer, a recognition that lives once vibrant had been left unfinished, their voices silenced mid-sentence. For decades, the silence of that disappearance remained complete. Radios no longer carried the boat's call sign, and the dock where it once tied off grew weathered, its planks splitting under snow and salt. What remained was memory, kept alive by those who could not let go. No one could have predicted that more than 30 years later, the silence itself would fracture, pierced by a signal that should have been impossible, carrying a call for help from men long gone and a boat that no longer existed. Time had a way of burying certain things, but not always in the same depth. In the town, memories of the vanished boat lay just beneath the surface, waiting for something as small as a smell of diesel on the air or a gull's distant cry to bring them back. But objects carried their own stubborn persistence, resisting burial. Decades after the boat's disappearance, one such object surfaced unexpectedly. The captain's logbook, half-filled, its spine cracked, its pages faintly smelling of sea salt, though they had not been near the ocean in over 30 years. It emerged from a trunk in an attic, uncovered by the captain's grown son while sorting through the belongings of his late mother. The leather binding was faded, edges fraying, but the writing inside remained sharp, the ink having bitten deeply into the paper. The logbook had traveled home with the family after the boat was declared lost. Returned by the Coast Guard, among other possessions, thought too small to matter at the time. It had been tucked away in grief, forgotten under the weight of survival, until it was uncovered again by hands that trembled as they opened it. The earliest entries were ordinary, almost mundane. Notes on tides, weather forecasts, catches measured in weight and value, small reminders about equipment repairs. They reflected the rhythm of a fisherman's life, where every day was a blend of labor, repetition, and quiet victories against a sea that never promised anything. Then came entries that began to carry a different weight. Subtle at first, mentions of strange swells where none were expected, of fog arriving too quickly, of compass readings that seemed to resist alignment. The captain, a practical man by all accounts, wrote without embellishment, yet between the lines there was unease, the kind that sharpened the eyes of those who knew how to read not only the words but the pauses between them. The final entries stopped abruptly, mid-thought as though interrupted by urgency. One page carried only half a sentence, ending in a dash followed by nothing. No conclusion, no signature, no farewell. The logbook's silence mirrored the silence that had stretched across the town since 1984, a silence that had never been explained. The unfinished words were like a breath held too long, suspended across decades. The discovery of the logbook did not stay private for long. In a community where stories traveled faster than boats, word spread quickly. Neighbors asked questions, families whispered, and soon the logbook became more than just paper and ink. It was a relic, a direct thread to the moment before the vanishing. Some in town gathered to read its pages together, searching for clues hidden in the neat handwriting, hoping to find an answer where none had been given. Others refused to look, unwilling to open wounds that had only barely scarred over. Historians and maritime enthusiasts found their way to the town, drawn by the resurfaced artifact. They studied the entries with clinical detachment, measuring phrases against weather reports and Coast Guard records from 1984. What they concluded was little more than what the families already knew. The sea had turned violent, and something had gone wrong. Yet those who had lived the loss read differently. They saw in the pages not only data but emotion, the way the captain's handwriting grew heavier toward the end, the way words shortened, clipped, as though written in haste. The logbook became a kind of mirror, reflecting back whatever the reader carried. For some, it confirmed that the boat had faced nothing more than a storm, tragic but explainable. For others, it raised more questions than it answered. Why stop mid-sentence? Why no mention of a mayday call? No sign of panic or finality? Why had the last words felt suspended rather than concluded? As the years pushed toward the third decade since the loss, the logbook settled into a kind of uneasy place in the community. It was neither ignored nor fully embraced, sitting in a glass case in the small maritime museum near the docks, a place where schoolchildren were brought on field trips and where fishermen sometimes stood silently, looking at the handwriting as if trying to hear the voice behind it. It reminded the town not only of what had been lost, but of what remained unfinished. For the captain's family, the logbook became a private burden. His son, who had first discovered it, often reread the last page late at night, the unfinished sentence echoing in his thoughts. He began to imagine what words might have followed the dash, as though completing the line could also complete the absence. Yet no imagined continuation could satisfy. The silence was too wide, too deep, and so the logbook remained, suspended between explanation and mystery, a half-told story written in salt-stained ink. For years, it was the closest anyone could come to the voices of those who had vanished. Until decades later, a different voice would break through, not in ink, but in static and signal, calling across time in a way that defied the boundaries of both logic and memory. The sea had a language of its own, but for those who worked upon it, the truest sense of safety often came not from sight or sound of waves, but from the crackle of the radio. Across the Alaskan coast in the 1980s, marine radios were lifelines, carrying voices through storms, sending warnings of shifting weather, and offering the reassurance that one was never fully alone on the vast water. Every boat carried its own call sign, a small identity among countless vessels, and fishermen learned to recognize each other not just by face but by the rhythm of a voice transmitted through static. In the weeks before the boat vanished, its call sign had been heard regularly, brief exchanges with other captains, weather updates given in a low, steady tone. There was nothing unusual, nothing to suggest silence would soon follow. And then, after its final check-in, the frequency went quiet. At first, no one noticed. Radios fell silent all the time. Storms disrupted them. Batteries weakened, equipment failed. But silence that persisted began to stand out, like a missing note in a song played too many times to ignore. The Coast Guard records from that winter told a simple story. Contact lost, no distress signal received, search initiated. Yet among fishermen, the absence of a mayday call weighed heavily. Boats that went down often had time to send at least a burst of urgency, a last breath across the airwaves. This one did not. The silence was absolute, as though the vessel had slipped not only beneath the sea but out of sound entirely. For the families waiting on shore, that silence became its own torment. No last words, no crackle of farewell, just a line that had gone dead without warning. Radio operators who had been on duty that winter remembered scanning the channels in long stretches of night, headphones pressing into their ears, hoping for the faintest reply. They reported hearing static shaped like voices, fragments of syllables that might have been nothing more than atmospheric interference. At times, they thought they heard the boat's call sign emerging faintly, only for it to dissolve before it could be confirmed. These moments entered logbooks as unverified signals, footnotes to a larger tragedy. The silence persisted, and the notations ended. In town, radios continued to hum in kitchens and on docks, symbols of a connection that families hoped might still bring them something. Wives kept them on longer than necessary, tuning into channels as though a familiar voice might yet break through. Children grew used to the sound of static as background noise, the ghost of communication lingering in their homes. After months, most turned the dials off for good. The silence had proven itself unbroken. Years slipped into decades and technology changed. Radios gave way to satellites, to digital systems, to more advanced equipment. The old analog channels fell into disuse, their frequencies left to wander through the air unchecked. For many, the silence of that lost call sign became not just a memory but a metaphor. It was how the town described grief that could not speak, how fishermen referenced dangers that left no warning. Silence became a language in itself, one that needed no translation. But silence also carried weight. For the older generation, it meant something unfinished, a lack of closure that could never fully heal. Radios still existed in homes, relics kept for sentiment rather than function, and some nights when wind rattled windows and the sea could be heard in the distance, a few turned the knobs, listening again. What they heard was always the same, Static, endless, and indifferent, a reminder of a voice cut off mid-journey. No one in those years could have imagined that silence could break after so long. The logic of technology, of time, insisted otherwise. Signals faded, batteries died, frequencies shifted. What was lost remained lost. And yet, as the town moved into the third decade since the disappearance, the impossible began to stir. In the dark rooms of Coast Guard stations and the controlled environments of signal monitoring facilities, faint interruptions in the static would one day be detected, an echo carrying across years, a plea embedded in silence, a voice that should not have been able to return. For now, in the decades before that moment, the silence remained intact, a silence thick enough to shape identity, deep enough to become part of the town's bones. It was the silence of radios left on too long, of searchers calling into voids, of widows standing by docks where no answers came. It was a silence that no one expected to break until it did. By 2017, more than 3 decades had passed since the boat's disappearance, and the story had settled into its final form for most, a closed chapter of maritime loss, a line in official records, a scar remembered only in the town that had lived it. The sea had taken many lives in those years, and though the vanished boat remained the most mysterious, time had dulled the edges of grief. New boats crowded the harbor, new crews set out at dawn, and the families who had once waited at the docks had aged into grandparents. Silence had become normal. Then, in a Coast Guard monitoring station, the silence broke. It happened during a routine sweep of marine frequencies, the kind of background task carried out daily by operators who had long since stopped expecting surprises. A burst of static arrived, jagged and uneven, but within it was rhythm. At first, the operator assumed it to be interference, signals from distant storms, reflections bouncing across atmospheric layers. Yet as the sound repeated, a shape emerged. Letters, clipped and imperfect but recognizable in their cadence, an SOS. More chilling than the signal itself was the call sign that followed, distorted but undeniable. It belonged to the fishing boat lost in 1984. The operator froze, headphones pressed tight as though holding the sound in place would make it clearer. It came again, fractured yet steady enough to confirm. The vanished boat was calling for help, 33 years too late. Reports moved quickly through official channels, carried in terse lines of text across digital screens. At first, disbelief dominated. Signals could be misheard, echoes could mimic patterns, and atmospheric anomalies were known to bend frequencies in strange ways. But recordings confirmed it. The transmission carried the old boat's identity, a voice resurrected from a time when analog radios were the only link to safety. The town heard soon after. News like this never remained confined to offices or reports. It traveled with urgency, slipping into phone calls whispered in grocery aisles, passed along docks where fishermen leaned in close to catch every detail. The widows, now older and hardened by decades of absence, received it with a strange mix of skepticism and dread. For some, it reopened wounds they had carefully sealed. For others, it stirred a fragile thread of hope, though they knew better than to name it aloud. Children who had grown into adults now listened to broadcasts and read articles online, astonished to see their father's boat mentioned in present tense. Speculation spread faster than the facts. Some claimed it was a hoax, a cruel imitation designed to stir old grief. Others whispered of signals trapped in the atmosphere, bouncing endlessly until conditions aligned to release them. Amateur radio enthusiasts across the country tuned their equipment to the reported frequency, chasing the phantom call. Some caught only static. A few swore they heard fragments of the SOS themselves, though none could capture it as clearly as the Coast Guard had. In the town, the event unsettled the fragile balance built over 3 decades. The dock where the boat had once tied off became a place of gathering again, families standing quietly, looking out over the water as though listening for something only they could hear. In kitchens, radios were switched back on, their static filling the air once more, not for communication but for the possibility of connection. Officials tried to calm the storm of speculation. Press releases framed the signal as an anomaly, a natural phenomenon, not evidence of survival or return. But such explanations did little to contain the emotional weight. For those who had lived through the vanishing, the signal was not just noise. It was a reminder that the story had not ended cleanly, that silence could fracture even decades later. The SOS repeated intermittently over the following weeks. Always faint, always incomplete, as though the voice behind it strained to reach across time. Each burst carried with it the same mixture of disbelief and longing. Some nights widows claimed they heard the rhythm of the signal even without radios, pulsing like a memory through their homes. The sound seemed to live both in the air and in the minds of those who needed to hear it most. No one could agree on its origin, but everyone agreed on one thing: the vanished boat was speaking again. Whether it was the sea releasing an echo held too long, or some quirk of machines reborn from the past, or something beyond explanation, the result was undeniable. The silence that had defined the town for 33 years had been broken. The question, unspoken but pressing, was simple. If a voice could return after so long, what else might the sea still hold waiting to be heard? When word of the intercepted SOS reached the families of the lost crew, it spread less like news and more like a tremor, an invisible force shaking foundations that had stood for decades. For 33 years they had lived in the shadow of absence, adjusting to routines built around silence. Some had remarried, raising children who carried no memory of the vanished men. Others had remained alone, their lives shaped by loyalty to those who never returned. For all of them, the sudden emergence of the signal struck like the reopening of an old wound, equal parts unbearable and irresistible. The widows, now older women with silver hair and lined faces, carried the heaviest weight. Many had spent years training themselves to avoid the subject, to speak of their husbands only in past tense, to fold grief into the background of daily life where it could not break them open. Yet the call sign of the boat, carried across the airwaves after so many years, pulled memory back into the present. Photographs that had gathered dust on shelves were wiped clean, letters tucked into drawers were read again, and possessions long boxed away were reopened. Grief resurfaced not as a sharp stab, but as a tide, pulling steadily at everything they had built since. For the children, now middle-aged, the weight was different. They had grown up with stories instead of fathers, their sense of identity shaped by absence more than presence. The signal gave them something they had never expected, proof that their fathers' voices still existed somewhere in the fabric of the world, carried on frequencies that refused to vanish. Some felt it as a gift, a belated acknowledgement that their loss had not been forgotten. Others felt it as cruelty, a reminder of what had been denied to them for so long. The town itself responded with a kind of unsettled reverence. People gathered in small clusters, speaking in hushed tones as though afraid the signal might overhear. The dock, weathered and nearly forgotten, became a place of quiet pilgrimage. Candles reappeared in windows at night, glowing points of memory as though the town itself had been pulled back to 1984. Shops displayed old photographs of the lost crew, clipped from newspapers, their faces suddenly present again in a place that had tried to move on. But with memory came conflict. Some wanted to embrace the signal as a sign, a bridge across time. They spoke of it with awe, as though the sea had finally given back what it had taken. Others resisted, arguing that reopening grief served no purpose. They feared the town would drown again in mourning, unable to live in the present if it kept listening for voices from the past. The signal, though faint and intermittent, divided as much as it united, exposing the fragile balance between remembrance and survival. For the Coast Guard and technicians monitoring the broadcasts, the signal was a puzzle. They traced its origin across frequencies, mapped its irregular bursts, compared it against known patterns of atmospheric interference. Their report spoke in technical terms of ionospheric reflection, ghost signals, and anomalies of propagation. Yet even among those whose work was grounded in science, there was unease. The consistency of the call sign, the precision of the SOS defied randomness. The signal carried intention, even if its source remained unknown. Families attended briefings, listening politely as experts explained the possible mechanics. But when they returned home, the language of science mattered little. What mattered was the sound itself, the thin thread of a voice cutting through time. In darkened living rooms, some replayed recordings late at night, pressing headphones close, straining to catch every fractured syllable. For a moment it felt like listening to the men themselves, as if they were speaking again, even if only in distress. Memory, once dormant, now became active. Stories long buried were told again, children asking their aging mothers about the final days before the boat left harbor, about the routines of men they had never known. The weight of memory pressed heavily on those conversations, thick with both love and sorrow. It was as though the town had been asked to carry the past anew, not as a story completed, but as one unfinished, stretching forward into the present. The sea, indifferent as ever, remained unchanged. Its horizon still stretched wide and cold, its tides still rose and fell. Yet for those who had lived under its shadow, the SOS had shifted the balance. What had once been final was now uncertain. What had once been sealed was now cracked open. Memory in its weight did not crush the town, but it bent it, altering how each person carried their own loss. No one yet knew what the signal meant, or whether it would ever be explained. But for the families and for the town, the weight of memory was undeniable. Pressing against every routine, every silence, every night when static hummed faintly on radios left on once again, the signal had stirred something that could not be ignored. Once the Coast Guard confirmed the recordings, the question moved quickly from what had been heard to what might still lie beneath the water. For decades, the ocean had given no trace of the vanished boat, no floating debris, no fragments of wood, not even a life jacket carried to shore. Now, with technology far more advanced than what existed in 1984, the prospect of searching again felt not only possible but necessary. Expeditions were organized with a mixture of caution and urgency. Sonar equipment, remotely operated vehicles and underwater drones were prepared for deployment in the waters where the boat had last been recorded. These were not the desperate search missions of 33 years earlier, carried out by pilots scanning waves with the naked eye. This was precise, methodical exploration of the seabed itself, capable of revealing shapes hidden under layers of sand and silt. The cold Alaskan depths, once impenetrable, had become accessible in ways unimaginable to those who had mourned in the 1980s. The sea, however, resisted intrusion. The waters near Kodiak were not only vast but treacherous. Currents ran with unpredictable force, and storms still gathered suddenly, rolling across the horizon with little warning. The depths themselves held an alien quality, where darkness consumed light within meters, and pressure crushed any object unprepared for its weight. To search here was not just an act of investigation, but of endurance. Each descent of a machine into the black water felt like a negotiation with something that preferred its secrets kept. Still, expeditions pressed forward. Screens lit with sonar images showing ridges, trenches, and shapes half buried in silt. Fishermen who had once scoured the surface for wreckage now watched quietly as monitors revealed the contours of the sea floor. For hours at a time, drones moved silently through darkness, their cameras catching glimpses of rock, twisted metal, and the shadows of fish moving like phantoms. Each possible shape was analyzed, catalogued, and dismissed if it failed to match the lines of a vessel. The families waited on shore, caught between dread and hope. Updates were delivered sparingly, filtered through official language that spoke of progress and ongoing efforts without promising discovery. For some, the search reopened old wounds they wished had remained sealed. For others, it was a chance at closure, the possibility of finally anchoring their grief to something tangible. Either way, the cold depths pulled at them, drawing their lives back toward the sea that had shaped and scarred them. Weeks of searching turned into months. At times, expeditions returned empty-handed, battered by storms, their equipment coated in salt and ice. Yet persistence carried them forward, fueled by the unrelenting question of the signal. If a voice could still be heard after 33 years, then surely something remained beneath the water to explain it. The sea, indifferent as always, gave only fragments of answers. A piece of twisted metal not belonging to the boat, the skeletal remains of other forgotten wrecks, debris that told stories of storms from different years, different tragedies. The search itself began to change the town. Conversations at the docks no longer dwelled only on the past, but on what might soon be found. Maps of the coastline were spread across tables in kitchens, families tracing possible routes the boat might have taken, speculating on currents and storms. Children, who had grown up with the story as legend, now spoke of sonar and drones with a curiosity that blurred grief with fascination. The vanished boat, once only memory, was becoming present again through the act of pursuit. And yet, there was unease. Some whispered that disturbing the depths invited consequences, that the sea returned only what it chose, and that pushing further into its silence might awaken things better left undisturbed. Others dismissed such thoughts as superstition, insisting that truth, however painful, was always better than mystery. Between these voices, the search continued, its machines diving deeper, its monitors glowing late into the night. It was on one of those nights, when a storm raged above and the ocean below lay still, that the first unmistakable image appeared. On the sonar screen beneath a shroud of silt and cold, a shape emerged that carried the unmistakable lines of a hull. It was angled awkwardly, as though leaning into the seabed itself, but its dimensions were clear. The boat that had vanished in 1984 was no longer only a memory. It had a place resting in the dark, waiting for eyes to find it again. The discovery did not yet answer the question of the signal, but it offered something undeniable, proof that the sea had not erased the vessel, only hidden it. What remained was to descend into the cold depths themselves, to look not just at the shape of the wreck, but into the story it still carried. The wreck's discovery beneath the Alaskan waters brought momentary stillness to the town. It was as if the ocean, after decades of silence, had finally offered proof of what everyone had long suspected yet never seen. But with that revelation came the more disquieting question. If the boat had rested untouched on the seabed for 33 years, how could its call sign have been heard alive on the radio? The wreck explained the loss, but it deepened the mystery of the signal. The answer, if it existed, would not come from the sea alone. It would come from the airwaves, from frequencies stretched across time and distance. Technicians and radio specialists pored over the recordings of the intercepted SOS, scrutinizing every second of static, every fractured syllable. Computers mapped the waveform, tracing the rise and fall of tones, the rhythm of pauses. What they found first was consistency. The signal was no random burst of interference. It carried order, intentional repetition, the kind only produced by a human hand, even if that hand had vanished long ago. The investigation expanded into archives. Old transmission logs from the 1980s were pulled from dusty shelves and scanned into digital databases. Radio patterns of the vanished boat were compared to the modern recordings, and in their alignment lay something uncanny. The cadence was identical. The call sign transmitted with the same pauses, the same slight irregularity in spacing that had marked the captain's style. To those who listened closely, it was as if his voice had been frozen in air and released decades later. Explanations were sought in science. Theories of ionospheric bounce suggested signals could travel vast distances, caught in layers of the atmosphere, reflecting back years later under rare conditions. Others proposed tropospheric ducting, or the possibility of signals being recorded, replayed or mimicked by unknown equipment. Each explanation carried fragments of plausibility, but none fit perfectly. The recording had a clarity that seemed impossible for something so aged, and its content, the precise repetition of SOS and call sign, felt too exact to be accident. As the technicians worked, the town leaned into its own form of investigation, memory. Old radio operators who had manned coastal stations in the 1980s were interviewed, their recollections compared with the present recordings. Some recalled faint signals back then, echoes that had never been confirmed, and listening now they swore the rhythm was the same. Others admitted the similarity unsettled them too deeply to dwell on. What science could not explain, memory absorbed as both comfort and unease. The search for answers reached beyond Alaska. Amateur radio communities across the world began scanning frequencies, reporting their own fragments of sound. In forums and late-night conversations across continents, the lost boat became a ghost story of the airwaves, its SOS heard faintly in places as far as Japan, Chile, and remote islands of the Pacific. Each report was catalogued, analyzed, and debated. Some were dismissed as coincidence. Others were preserved, mapped onto global charts that showed strange lines of transmission connecting oceans and skies. In laboratories, digital models simulated how a signal from 1984 might still exist. Some researchers suggested that under rare atmospheric conditions, old transmissions could be trapped in ionospheric layers, like echoes in a canyon, released years later when conditions aligned. But even among the most optimistic scientists, the span of 33 years was unprecedented. The signal, if natural, was an outlier beyond explanation. For the families, none of the technical terms mattered. What mattered was the sensation of hearing a voice they thought had been erased. They attended briefings not for theories, but for the recordings themselves, played again and again in rooms where the sound of static grew heavy with silence. Each repetition carried the same impossible rhythm, the call for help, the familiar call sign as though the men had never stopped speaking. The weight of memory met the uncertainty of science, and between them stretched a space no one could fill. In the end, the data trail grew longer, but not clearer. Charts multiplied, waveforms were archived, and yet the question remained. The boat was on the seabed silent, its crew long gone. But the voice carried on, leaping across time in defiance of both reason and grief. The technicians had mapped the signal's shape. What they had not mapped was its meaning. The trail of data pointed in many directions, toward science, toward mystery, toward memory itself. But it pointed most of all toward the wreck resting in the cold depths, waiting for eyes to look inside and find whether it held more than silence. The discovery of the wreck on sonar screens had been a turning point, but seeing the boat itself, resting in the cold stillness of the ocean floor, was something altogether different. The remotely operated vehicles descended into the depths with lights that cut thin beams through the black water, illuminating a world untouched since 1984. As the hull emerged from the dark, the watching eyes on monitors above felt a collective tightening in their chests. The boat lay tilted on its side, its bow angled downward into the seabed, as if caught mid-motion in a slow fall. The wooden structure, battered but still intact, had been preserved by the freezing waters, its paint faded to ghostly hues. Nets clung to its frame like tattered fabric, and the wheelhouse windows stared outward, as hollow eyes, glass fractured, but not gone. It was not ruin. It was a vessel frozen in time, a memory given form in the silent deep. The drones moved closer, their cameras capturing details long denied to those waiting above. Rust had spread across the metal fittings, but the shape of the boat was unmistakable. The name still faintly clung to its stern, letters worn but legible, carrying the identity that had echoed across airwaves decades later. Barnacles and sea growth clung to its sides, life reclaiming wood and steel. Yet beneath it all the boat remained itself, stubbornly resistant to disappearance. Inside, the exploration grew heavier. The wheelhouse contained objects scattered by the moment of impact, charts half decayed, a compass cracked but recognizable, a chair twisted against the wall. A coffee mug rested on its side, still intact, its handle broken. It was the kind of detail that made the absence of life even sharper, a reminder that men had moved through this space only hours before it had been claimed by the sea. In the captain's cabin, drawers had spilled their contents, clothing, notebooks, and a knife with a worn handle. One drawer remained locked, its contents sealed as though still waiting for hands that would never return. Most haunting were the personal artifacts. A boot caught in a corner, a watch resting in silt, a deck of playing cards that had fused together in a block. Each item carried the weight of memory, but none gave answers. The wreck was silent. There were no bodies, no signs of struggle beyond the violence of sinking. It was as if the men had simply dissolved into the water, leaving their belongings as the only evidence of their existence. The recovered images spread quickly through the town. Families gathered in rooms where screens displayed the wreck, tears flowing silently as they watched the boat reappear from darkness. Some gasped when they saw familiar objects, the mug, the compass, the handwriting faintly visible on a chart. These were not abstractions. They were the fragments of lives once intertwined with their own. Closure felt both closer and impossibly far. Officials debated recovery. The boat lay deep in waters difficult and costly to reach. Some argued it should remain undisturbed, a grave best left in peace. Others pressed for raising it, to finally bring the vessel home, to place it in a harbor where families could touch it, walk around it, reclaim something tangible from the sea. The decision lingered, complicated by expense, politics, and the question of what recovery could truly offer. In the meantime, divers collected smaller artifacts, carefully sealed in containers to prevent decay. These items were delivered to families who touched them with reverence, as though holding them could bridge the distance between past and present. A watch wound into silence, a knife worn by calloused hands, a single playing card preserved against odds. Each object was both comfort and torment, proof of what had been, reminder of what was gone, and still the signal persisted. Even as the wreck rested silently on the seabed, the airwaves carried its call sign. The contradiction deepened. The boat was here undeniably still, yet its voice echoed elsewhere, alive in frequencies that should have died with it. The hull explained the silence of 1984, but it did not explain the sound of 2017. The families, the town, and the technicians all found themselves caught between two truths. The boat had ended, yet the boat still spoke. The recovered hull did not close the story. It opened it wider. It anchored the memory in wood, steel, and silt, but it left the signal hanging unanswered in the air, pressing for explanation. The sea had revealed its hold, but the mystery stretched beyond it, into invisible paths traced by waves of sound. Carrying voices that refused to be silenced, the wreck lay silent on the seabed, its story etched in silt and decay, but the signal still pulsed across frequencies, as if the boat had never stopped speaking. For weeks after the discovery of the hull, the Coast Guard and teams of specialists worked tirelessly to reconcile the contradiction. How could a vessel lying lifeless beneath the ocean continue to broadcast a call for help, 33 years after its final descent? The investigation turned increasingly technical. Moving from the seabed to the skies, scientists and radio engineers studied the conditions of the ionosphere, the charged layer of the atmosphere capable of bending and carrying signals across vast distances. Under ordinary circumstances, marine transmissions faded quickly, their energy dissipating into space. But under rare conditions, certain frequencies could become trapped, bouncing endlessly between the Earth and atmospheric layers. It was this phenomenon, some argued, that might have preserved the vanished boat's SOS, holding it like an echo in a canyon. Waiting until 2017 for release, the explanation, though elegant, did not satisfy everyone. The persistence of a signal for more than 3 decades defied known science. Researchers delved deeper, simulating models in laboratories, reproducing conditions that could extend the life of a transmission. Some produced brief results, echoes lasting minutes, hours, even days, but years, let alone decades, remained elusive. Others suggested that the SOS had not been trapped since 1984, but rather triggered again in recent years by interference, as though dormant energy had been awakened. A second line of inquiry explored the possibility of mechanical persistence. Could some fragment of the boat's radio equipment, sealed within the wreck, have survived long enough to broadcast anew? The cold waters had preserved wood and steel. Perhaps they had preserved electronics too. Divers returned to the wreck, searching the wheelhouse for remnants of the radio system. They found corroded equipment, wires twisted with salt, and fragments of knobs and dials, but nothing intact enough to function. The idea of a machine broadcasting across decades collapsed under the weight of water and time. Amid the scientific debates, families and townspeople listened to explanations with quiet patience, but also skepticism. They had lived long enough with absence to know that science did not always answer grief. Some embraced the idea of echoes, signals that refused to die, voices caught in the air like memories in the mind. Others dismissed it all, believing the signal to be less about technology and more about the persistence of the past itself, refusing to vanish no matter how many years passed. What complicated the matter further was the precision of the signal. The call sign was always identical, the SOS steady in rhythm. It was not distorted into unrecognizable fragments, but carried with clarity, like a voice speaking across a thin veil. Recordings compared with the original logbook of the captain's radio transmissions confirmed the match, down to the peculiar spacing between syllables. To those who knew him, it was his voice, his hand on the transmitter, speaking again through channels that should have been silent. Reports circulated internationally, drawing attention from scientists, historians, and even philosophers who saw in the event not merely a technical puzzle, but a question of time itself. Was it possible for human actions to leave imprints so deep they reverberated across decades, audible to those who came after? Could the ocean and sky together conspire to preserve a plea for help beyond the span of a lifetime? For the town, the explanation mattered less than the experience. They gathered in community halls where the recording was played, listening not to science but to memory. The sound filled the room, fractured and ghostly yet undeniably present. Some wept openly. Others sat in silence, letting the rhythm of the SOS press into them like a heartbeat. The meaning was not in the technical diagrams or models, but in the simple fact that the voices of the lost men had reached them again. Eventually, the official conclusion was released. The signal was a product of atmospheric phenomena, a rare and extraordinary echo preserved in ways not fully understood. It was filed in reports with diagrams and cautious language, declared unusual but explainable within the boundaries of science. Yet beneath the official words lay something unsaid. No one truly knew. The mystery remained, suspended between fact and faith, between machine and memory. The sea had given back its hull, and the sky had given back its voice. Both stood as reminders that disappearance was never absolute, that time itself sometimes faltered in its silence. What remained was not the question of how, but of what to do with what had been returned. The town waited for that answer, standing again by the water, staring into the same horizon where the boat had once vanished. The SOS had been explained but not solved. It lingered still, pulsing faintly across airwaves, as if refusing to let the story end. The winter after the signal was first heard again settled heavily across the Alaskan town, covering the harbor in frost and softening the outlines of the boats tied to the docks. Life had resumed its ordinary rhythm. Nets cast, engines humming, fish brought ashore, but beneath that routine lay a quiet awareness that nothing was quite the same. The vanished boat, once only memory, now lived again in two forms, as a hull resting silently on the seabed and as a voice carried faintly through airwaves, a presence that neither time nor science could entirely explain. For the families, closure had come in fragments rather than a single moment. Some held the recovered artifacts close, small tokens of men who had never returned, objects that gave shape to grief that had been weightless for decades. Others chose to let the sea keep what it had claimed, refusing to open boxes or touch mementos. Each carried the story differently, but all carried it still. The signal, even after explanations were offered, remained part of their lives, sometimes played again at night, sometimes avoided altogether, depending on how much weight the heart could bear. The town itself changed in subtler ways. The dock once left empty as a kind of shrine was finally repaired, its planks strengthened, its cleats used again by new boats. Yet those who tied their vessels there did so with quiet respect, as though aware of the shadow that lingered on the wood. Children who had grown up hearing the story told it now to their own children, not as a tale of terror, but as a lesson about the sea's mysteries, about the way loss could stretch across time without fully fading. The Coast Guard closed their official reports, shelving the documents alongside other maritime records. Scientists published papers, their diagrams and models archived in journals, explanations filed neatly even if never fully complete. But outside the language of reports, the mystery lived on. Amateur radio operators still tuned their sets, hoping to catch the faint pulse of the SOS, some claiming they heard it, others insisting the silence had returned for good. The truth was less important than the possibility, the idea that somewhere in the vast, restless air above the ocean, a voice still lingered. On quiet nights when the sea lay still and the town's lights glowed faintly against the snow, widows sometimes sat by their windows, listening not to radios but to memory. The rhythm of the SOS had become part of them, like the echo of a heartbeat too far away to touch, yet too familiar to ignore. Some found peace in it, imagining it as a message not of desperation but of persistence, proof that their loved ones had not vanished completely. Others found in it only sorrow, a reminder that some questions could never be answered. The wreck was left undisturbed in the depths, a compromise between recovery and respect. It rested there as a monument, unseen but present, its story carried not by stone markers or written names, but by the water itself. Fishermen passing over the coordinates lowered their voices, engines steady, aware that beneath them lay more than wood and steel. Beneath them lay lives interrupted mid-sentence, still echoing in ways no one could fully explain. The sea remained what it had always been, vast, indifferent, sometimes generous, sometimes cruel. The town remained what it had always been, resilient, bound to the water by necessity and love even when it took more than it gave. The story of the vanished boat became part of that binding, woven into the identity of a place where memory and mystery lived side by side, and so the years turned again. The signal, whether heard or imagined, whether explained or unsolved, lingered like a low hum beneath the noise of life. It was no longer a plea for help, but a reminder of voices that once called across water, of bonds that distance and time could not erase, of a sea that never forgot even when it seemed silent. Still waters held the wreck, still waters carried the echoes, and still waters watched as the town, marked but unbroken, continued its life along the edge of the ocean, carrying both grief and resilience into the horizon of each new day.